Some serial killers become household names, their crimes etched into the dark history of America. But others are just as terrifying, sometimes worse, yet they slip through the cracks of public memory. Tonight we start with one such predator, Paul Rung. Imagine opening your front door to a man who promises you a new job, a better future, and maybe even a little hope. You have no reason to distrust him. He smiles, he's polite, and he looks like any other ordinary guy. But behind that door waits a nightmare. Because once you stepped into Paul Rung's trap, you never walked back out. Paul Frederick Rung was born in Oak Lawn, Illinois, in 1970. On the surface, nothing about his childhood suggested the monster he would become, but people who knew him later recalled a temper that flared quickly and a disturbing fascination with violence. By the time he was in his teens, the signs were impossible to ignore. At just 17 years old, he was arrested for a horrific sexual assault. He was sent to prison, where he spent years behind bars, supposedly paying his debt to society. But in reality, prison didn't change him. If anything, it sharpened his cruelty and gave him time to think about how he could get away with worse crimes once he got out. By the mid-1990s, Rung was free again, and he wasted no time putting his new methods into practice. He had learned that brute force alone wasn't enough. If he wanted to continue undetected, he needed to lure his victims. So he came up with a plan: use job offers as bait. Back then, job postings were often found in newspapers and community boards. Rung would call women who had listed themselves as looking for work, or placed ads offering babysitting, cleaning, or other services. He would pretend to be a professional, someone offering legitimate employment. The voice on the other end of the phone was calm, polite, reassuring. He sounded like an opportunity, not a threat. But when women arrived to meet him, the mask of politeness slipped away. Behind the closed doors of his apartment, Rung revealed who he really was: a predator. Victims were bound, assaulted, and murdered. He treated human lives like disposable objects, discarding them without remorse. Investigators would later say that the sheer brutality of his crimes made him one of the most dangerous predators in Illinois. One of the most chilling aspects of Runger's crimes was his ability to blend in. Neighbors thought he was just another man, living quietly in the suburbs. He had girlfriends, he went to work, he didn't stand out, and that was exactly how he wanted it, because the less attention he attracted, the more freedom he had to keep hunting. For years, Runger operated under the radar, but killers always make mistakes, and Runger's arrogance became his downfall. He believed he was smarter than the police, smarter than the justice system, smarter than everyone. But science was catching up with him. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, DNA evidence was becoming one of law enforcement's strongest weapons. Samples collected from crime scenes began to link Runger to a string of murders that stretched back years. Investigators realized they weren't dealing with isolated cases, they were dealing with a serial killer. In 1997, one of his victims, a young woman named Yolanda Gutierrez, was lured under the same pretense of a job opportunity. Her murder left police searching for answers, but the trail went cold. Later, DNA tied Runger directly to her case, and she wasn't the only one. Several other women had vanished in ways that followed his exact pattern. Each story told the same tale: a promise of work, an invitation, and then silence. When Runger was finally arrested, prosecutors didn't hold back. They called him a serial predator without remorse, and a man who thrived on cruelty. In court, jurors were shown the evidence, DNA, testimony, and details of his methods. It painted the picture of a man who had spent years perfecting the art of manipulation and violence. In 2006, the verdict came down. Paul Rungers was sentenced to death. For the families of his victims, it was a small measure of justice, though no sentence could ever truly undo the pain he caused. Some family members spoke out in court, describing how Rungers had stolen daughters, sisters, and mothers from them. Their grief was raw, but their voices were firm. They wanted the world to know what this man had done, but in a twist that angered many, Rungers' death sentence was never carried out. In 2011, Illinois abolished the death penalty, and his sentence was commuted to life in prison without parole. That meant he would never face execution. Instead, he would live out the rest of his days behind bars, far from the lives he once terrorized. For some, that was enough, knowing he would never be free again. But for others, it was another cruel injustice, a reminder that Paul Rungers got to keep the life he had stolen from so many others.
Paul Rungers thought he was invincible, that he could outsmart the police and bury his crimes forever. But DNA told the truth, and justice caught up with him. Yet, as chilling as his story is, he wasn't alone. Across the country, another predator was carving out his own trail of destruction, this one on the opposite side of America. His name was Sebastian Shaw, and his crimes left bodies scattered in the wilderness.
If Paul Rung's story shows us how killers hide in plain sight, then Sebastian Shaw's story is about something darker: arrogance. Because Shaw wasn't just a murderer, he was a man who believed he was smarter than everyone else. He wanted control, he wanted recognition, and most disturbingly, he wanted to keep killing. Sebastian Shaw, born in 1967, didn't grow up with an ordinary childhood. From an early age, he displayed patterns that experts later described as red flags: anger, impulsiveness, and a fascination with violence. Like many future predators, his early years were marked by instability and a sense of detachment from normal life. Teachers noticed he was disruptive. Friends, or those who tried to be his friends, remembered him as cold, even cruel. By the time he reached adulthood, Shaw was already on the radar for petty crimes, but no one knew he was capable of much worse. He moved to Oregon in the late 1980s, trying to reinvent himself. On the surface, he blended in like any other young man in his 20s. But behind that mask, a violent hunger was growing. Shaw's first confirmed murders began in 1991. His victims were women, vulnerable, often living on the margins of society, and easy for him to manipulate. The cases shocked investigators, not only for the brutality, but for the way Shaw seemed to vanish afterward. Bodies were found in wooded areas, discarded like trash, with little evidence left behind. Police suspected they were dealing with a calculated predator, but they didn't yet know his name. In one case, Shaw lured a young woman with promises of fun and companionship. What she found instead was a nightmare. He attacked her, leaving her lifeless body in a remote area outside Portland. For Shaw, it wasn't just about murder, it was about control, domination, and the thrill of getting away with it. Investigators began connecting dots. The similarities between the crimes pointed to a single killer. Victims were bound, discarded in wooded or rural areas, and left in conditions that made evidence difficult to recover. Shaw knew the terrain well, and he used it to his advantage, but Shaw wasn't content with simply hiding. He wanted people to know how smart he was. That arrogance became part of his downfall. After one of his arrests on unrelated charges, Shaw made statements that alarmed investigators. He hinted at knowing about unsolved murders. He bragged about things that only the killer would know. Detectives quickly realized they had their suspect. When DNA testing tied him directly to multiple cases, Shaw's mask came off completely. In interviews and during the trial, he showed almost no remorse. In fact, he acted as though he enjoyed the attention. Prosecutors painted him as a manipulative, sadistic killer who preyed on vulnerable women and thought he was untouchable. By 1998, Shaw was convicted of 3 murders in Oregon, but detectives always suspected that number was much higher. Some investigators believed he could be linked to as many as 13 deaths, maybe more, yet Shaw never admitted to them, choosing instead to keep his secrets and enjoy the speculation. In prison, his behavior was just as disturbing as his crimes. Guards described him as smug and difficult, a man who thrived on playing games with those around him. Fellow inmates avoided him. He seemed to enjoy the idea that he was feared, even behind bars. For the families of his victims, Shaw's trial and conviction were bittersweet. On one hand, they had justice; he would never walk free again. On the other hand, many believed he never faced the true weight of his crimes. By never confessing to the full number of murders, he denied families closure. To this day, some Oregon families wonder if their missing loved ones were among Shaw's victims. Shaw remained locked away for the rest of his life. He never gained the notoriety of other serial killers. There were no documentaries plastered with his face, no endless debates on talk shows about his motives, and in a way that obscurity may have been his greatest punishment. For a man who craved recognition, being forgotten was the worst fate of all. On June 11, 2021, Sebastian Shaw died in prison at the age of 53. The official reports listed his death as natural causes, but for the families of the women he killed, there was nothing natural about it. His death closed one chapter, but it didn't erase the pain he caused. Sebastian Shaw's arrogance destroyed lives. He thought he could play God, choosing who lived and who died, while bragging about his crimes like they were trophies. But in the end, he died behind prison walls, remembered only by the families who still grieve. And while Shaw's story might have ended in obscurity, our next killer's story is different.
Because Malik Samartani, better known as Lawrence Banks, didn't just target strangers. His victims were often the people closest to him: family, roommates, people who trusted him the most. His violence was personal, and it spanned decades.
If Paul Rung showed us how predators lure strangers, and Sebastian Shaw showed us the arrogance of a killer who wanted recognition, then Malik Samartani reveals something even darker, because his victims weren't strangers at all. They were family, roommates, people who trusted him the most. His violence wasn't random, it was intimate, and it spanned decades. Malik Samartani, born Lawrence Banks in 1947, grew up in Baltimore, Maryland. From an early age, people around him noticed something was off. He was violent, unpredictable, and prone to explosive fits of rage. Unlike some killers who hide their aggression, Samartani's violence was out in the open. But what makes his story chilling is how he turned that violence inward on his own family. In the 1970s, Banks had already built a reputation with police. Arrests for assaults and domestic violence piled up. His partners and family members lived in constant fear of his temper. In 1976, that temper escalated into his first murder conviction. Banks killed his wife in a brutal attack. He was sentenced to prison, but in what many later called a grave mistake, he was eventually released. You would think someone given a second chance might try to rebuild their life, but not Samartani. Once he was out, he went right back to violence. In 1991, his daughter Arja became his next victim. She was only 17 years old. Her body was found stuffed into a bag, discarded as if her life meant nothing. Banks was arrested and convicted, but incredibly, he still didn't stay behind bars permanently. Despite killing not one but two people, he would walk free again. For many in Baltimore, the justice system had failed. Here was a man with a clear history of murder, allowed back into society not once but twice, and each time someone paid with their life. By the 2000s, Banks had changed his name to Malik Samartani. Some speculated he was trying to escape his past, to distance himself from his earlier crimes. But a new name didn't mean a new man. The violence was still there, waiting to resurface. In 2019, at the age of 65, Samartani struck again. This time his victim was his roommate, 41-year-old Dominique Foster. Foster's body was discovered dismembered, her remains placed in plastic bags and scattered. The brutality shocked even veteran detectives who had seen decades of crime scenes. For them, this was different. It was calculated, cold, and deeply personal. Police quickly identified Samartani as their prime suspect. Given his history, it didn't take long to connect the dots. Witnesses described his erratic behavior in the days leading up to Foster's disappearance. Surveillance footage and physical evidence tied him directly to the crime. For investigators, it was clear this wasn't a man who had slipped after years of good behavior. This was a killer who had never stopped being dangerous. When Samartani was arrested, the public's reaction was one of anger and disbelief. How could a man with such a violent history have been released so many times? How many lives could have been saved if he had been kept behind bars after his first murder? Those questions still hang over Baltimore today. During his trial, prosecutors laid out his decades of violence. They reminded jurors that this wasn't an isolated crime. This was a man with a pattern, a history of destruction that stretched back nearly half a century. They painted him as a predator who preyed not on strangers, but on those closest to him, people who should have been able to trust him. In 2023, Malik Samartani was sentenced to life in prison without parole. At last, it seemed the system had closed the door on him for good. There would be no more second chances, no more releases. He would spend the rest of his days behind bars where he belonged. But the scars of his actions remain. Families torn apart, lives stolen, communities left wondering how this man was allowed to continue his violence for so long. For many, justice came too late. Paul Rung lured women with promises of work. Sebastian Shaw left bodies in the wilderness and bragged about his brilliance. And Malik Samartani murdered his own family, his partners, and anyone unlucky enough to live too close to him. 3 different killers, 3 different methods, but one chilling truth: not every monster becomes famous. Some hide in plain sight, escaping the headlines, while their victims are left in the shadows. And maybe that's the most frightening part, because for every Bundy or Dahmer whose names we all remember, there are killers like Rung, Shaw, and Samartani, forgotten by most but just as deadly. Their stories remind us that evil doesn't always look like a stranger in the dark. Sometimes it looks like a neighbor, a friend,
even family. So what do you think? Should these men be remembered alongside the so-called famous serial killers? Or is obscurity the only justice they deserve? Let me know in the comments. I'll be reading your thoughts.